Gi idamik sitsagek sitsigo nistu anagok biksibidaki. Hi everybody, it's me, your host, Andrea Truejoy Fox for Talks with a Fox podcast. Today I want to share some things with you that have been on my mind and have percolated in my memory, things that I have experienced, and also conversations I've had with some of my fellow educator friends and colleagues. But before I get into that, I want to start off by acknowledging my elders, my grandparents, and my parents for what they have taught me and that I am still learning. I will always be learning. And as the elders say, we do not know everything. That's why Creator put us on this earth so we can learn. So long as we are here to learn. What I'm going to share with you today comes from my heart. It comes from a place of learning. It comes from my experience as a teacher, and it comes from those who have taught me. Today, I will be sharing my perspectives, my experience, my knowledge, and understandings about education systems. I will focus on two areas today, as I will be addressing two questions I am often asked by other teachers, and more so non-Indigenous teachers and educators. I hope what I share with you today, you can take with you and apply what works for you, what you feel supports you in your own teaching practice, and for those who are not teaching, that you are able to learn more about education systems from my Nitsitapiaki, Indigenous Blackfoot woman perspective and voice. Are you ready to join me on this journey? I am so excited you are here and that I can share with you some things that have helped me along the way in my teaching journey. Okay, so first off, I am often asked these two questions. What is the key to Indigenous student success? And the other question that I often am asked about is, why is there a lack of engagement from First Nations students and families in schools off reserve? I will restate that question because I'm not comfortable with the way it sounds, but I'm just reiterating questions that I'm often asked by other non-Indigenous educators. We're going to start off by unpacking the first question. What is the key to Indigenous student success? I want to say that there is no one answer, no one size fits all to this valuable question. And firstly, there is no one student that learns the same. Every student learns differently because every student is different. It is a question, though, that I hope all educators ask themselves. What is a key to Indigenous student success? Really, it's taking a look at what can we do better every day as educators to support Indigenous student success. I will also be looking at this question more so from how education systems function for Indigenous students who go to school off reserve, okay? So let us look at the hiring practices first off in non-Indigenous education systems, or rather education systems that are located off the reserve. Hiring First Nations educators, such as teachers, principals, elders, consultants, and so on, to develop, to implement, and to oversee the curriculum is a key component to improving education systems and education experience for Indigenous students. It's very important that you have the very people who have that lived experience, that knowledge, that perspective, that authentic view and voice, that they can be part of designing these new education supports around curriculum and programming. This is an area that continues to remain in a deficit in the education systems for students K-12 and also at the post-secondary levels, where we are continuing to see non-Indigenous and more specifically white educators teaching Indigenous courses and curriculum. And that is troubling because if we look at the increasing of Indigenous peoples across Canada alone, we are the highest growing population, which means that we are continuing to see the increase of Indigenous students attending schools off reserve. This speaks to the hiring practices and protocols in place where non-First Nations school systems have little to no First Nations Indigenous staff, including those in leadership roles. Currently, Many Indigenous educators are speaking up, and we are addressing these challenges that we face working in these education systems with white leadership in roles such as human resources, superintendents, directors, principals, and so on. The incidents that are being reported are now coming to light. They're being spoken about. They are on the rise, unfortunately, where Indigenous educators, we are sharing our accounts of the unfair treatment, racist incidents, and that feeling, and not just that feeling, but rather that knowing that we are constantly being watched. There's always that looking over our shoulders by white superiors who are constantly monitoring what we are doing in our roles, which not only make our roles more challenging, but it really jeopardizes what we can do successfully as Indigenous leaders. And that, unfortunately, is something that I've experienced myself, as have many other Indigenous educators, as I mentioned, who are now speaking up about these incidents, racist incidents, because it's unacceptable. It's 2020, and really, if we really want to talk about bettering education as a whole, well, that is a priority that all education systems need to look at and need to start dealing with, and ensuring that Indigenous educators are not going to work feeling that they are going to be treated unfairly, and that simply because they're Indigenous, that is going to dictate how they are supported in their own schools, their own place of work. And what I can say is that trickles down to student learning. So that is one area, if we want to look at how we can support Indigenous student success, is the hiring, the increasing of hiring Indigenous educators. And I will say there are so many Indigenous educators out there, and we are trained in many areas of expertise. We bring so much richness to the table, to the whole world of education. And for the education systems that are smart enough and open enough to hire us, they get to see this firsthand. And when they set up environments for their Indigenous staff to feel welcomed, because like I say, that trickles down to how Indigenous students feel welcomed and how Indigenous families and communities feel welcomed in these school systems. Next, I want to address programs and curriculum development. Needs to be the programs and curriculum development that are about First Nations histories needs to have Indigenous Nitsitabi, which means Indigenous, the real people, consultants leading the planning and development of these programs and curriculum. I cannot stress how important and imperative this is that Indigenous educators and elders are at the table to lead, oversee, and make informed decisions about Indigenous education, which is also part of the Education for All, because all students will be accessing this curriculum. They will be learning about it. So it's very crucial that we have the very people who are part of this curriculum, that this curriculum is teaching Canadian students about, students attending schools in Canada. It really should come from the people themselves who know this history very well and who know it best, which are Indigenous people. Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous ways of knowing cannot be duplicated or imitated. There are very few First Nations teachers, principals, and superintendents being hired to work in the schools off reserve, and yet, as I mentioned, the First Nations enrollment in these schools is rising rapidly. So would it not only make sense to ensure that so does the increasing rate of hiring Indigenous educators continue to rise? Attached to enrollment is funding. That should be allocated for the benefit of supporting and nurturing First Nation students and First Nation education in these schools. That is a part of this Indigenous student success, because again, when we look at where is the funding going to, where is it being allocated to? Is it going into programs that will support Indigenous engagement, that will bring in the hiring of Indigenous staff, that will allow to create spaces that are culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate and safe for Indigenous students to access in these schools? Yet, we still do not see very many Indigenous First Nation educators and leaders working in these systems as teachers and in leadership roles that can best support and facilitate learning environments that support and nurture Indigenous student learning, and that other teachers, non-Indigenous included, can learn from, can model after these leadership roles, who can implement, facilitate, guide, and teach other educators how to educate Indigenous students appropriately and to teach the curriculum appropriately for all students. Needs it to be. Indigenous First Nations parents and families are coming forward. They're starting to come forward and ask important questions that pertain to their children's education, which includes inquiries about the curriculum. Who is teaching it? How is it being taught? And what is being taught? Furthermore, Indigenous parents, families, and communities want to see accountability and transparency around funding as they ask important questions, such as, where is the funding going to that my child's enrollment brings into the school? These are all particularly important and necessary questions, and I do encourage Indigenous parents to continue asking these questions that pertain to their child's education in all facets. It is their right to know. It is our right to know, to ensure that our children are being taught appropriately. And it is our right to inquire about the learning environments that our children are spending time in, many hours. You know, if you calculate the hours in a day and in a week, in a month, and then how many months children are in school for, 10 months, that's a lot of time, and that's a lot of time away from their families. And for Indigenous peoples, family is at the core. It's a big part of who we are. So we as educators have a very important responsibility to ensure that we are giving all Indigenous students a safe space and place to learn and where they feel like they belong. Education systems must become accountable and more transparent about these questions that Indigenous parents have about funding, about the curriculum, and the concerns that our communities have, that our Indigenous communities are asking. If our parents and children are going to develop a sense of trust and communicable, engaging relationship with education systems, well, education systems ought to ensure that they are doing what's necessary to develop and sustain a healthy, appropriate, positive relationship with Indigenous parents, students, and communities. Reciprocity, that's a key value in many of our Indigenous cultures. What we take, we must give something back. And in this case, if we look at the healing that is paired with how our Indigenous people have been traumatized, murdered, abused, displaced in residential schools, and then here we are in 2020. Well, where is it where education leaders stop and say, okay, enough is enough. We need to ensure that every single Indigenous child has a positive, healthy, supportive experience when they attend our schools, the schools off reserve. These are things to think about, and these are things that for those who are in a role to develop policy, those who sit on parent advisory committees, those who sit on school boards, even non-Indigenous parents, it's important. This is everybody's responsibility, because Indigenous people did not ask to be abused. We did not ask to be taken from our families and our communities. Everything that has happened to us in residential schools, we are still suffering from generational trauma, intergenerational trauma from what has happened. Just because the children that are in the schools in 2020 did not attend residential schools, it does not mean that they are not impacted. We are all impacted, and it has changed our lives, and it has changed our way of being. So as educators, we do have that role. Anybody who goes into education in Canada, speaking about Canada alone right now, you will be teaching Indigenous children. It doesn't matter if you're in a city, in a town, working in a remote area, there will always be an Indigenous child or children attending your school in your classroom. So I want to encourage all educators, learn the history, get to know the community, connect with the community, learn about your students and learn from them. Be okay and be humbled that they will teach you things As a teacher myself, a lot of my greatest teachers have been my students. I've learned so much from being a teacher simply by learning from my students. There's much to be acknowledged that children and youth have a very important and special gift in the way they see the world, their perspectives. And sometimes as adults, we can almost forget that or even dismiss that. But in Nitsitabi ways of knowing, in Blackfoot and Indigenous ways of knowing, our children and our youth are very sacred, and they are at the center of our communities. They are who we take care of. They are who we nurture and hold sacred and ensure that we are preparing them for the future so that they can continue to take care of those who come after them. Another area of education that I am asked about by non-Indigenous educators that I would like to address is the age-old question around lack of engagement of Indigenous students attending schools off reserve. Well, first of all, this is not a new question. It is not a new issue that is attached to Indigenous student success and learning. However, before I address that, I do want to preclude this question by stating the following. It is often that First Nation children and youth who attend school off reserve can be marginalized and are marginalized for not being engaged when they are often misunderstood and or misperceived as being disengaged with school and their learning environments. Well, again, we need to step back and we need to take a look at the big picture here. We need to take a 360 look around and see what role and the history that education has had in Indigenous lives, in Indigenous people's communities and histories. Well, it has not been, for the most part, a very positive one. And historically, it has not been a positive one because of residential schools and what has happened there. So if we look at to where we are at now in 2020, that relationship is still one that has a long ways to go before we can fully say that collectively education is a safe place and space for all Indigenous children, and that every single Indigenous child and youth will have a positive experience, because the reality and the stats tell us otherwise. The level of Indigenous students who are not graduating from high school, who are not attending school regularly, we can look at the child and say, why aren't you attending school? Or if only this child attended regularly, they would have had success and they would have gone on past high school and into university or college or wherever. However, education systems need to stop and look in the mirror and ask the bigger questions. What are we doing? What can we do? And what do we need to do to make education experiences better, healthier, and positive for all Indigenous students? That is the question that educators need to be asking, more so than why are Indigenous students not engaged? And again, I will say this, speaking from my own experience. I'll speak from my experience as a student. I may have been misperceived as being disengaged simply because I had quite an imagination and I did not always enjoy school because of my learning environments. In my previous episode where I've talked about the Orange Shirt Day and my own experiences as an Indigenous student, a Blackfoot student, attending schools off reserve, it was not always the most positive one for me, and I know for others, many others. But there were also moments where I did enjoy school, and that was when I had teachers that I felt listened to me and they saw me, and they didn't just see me as being a student, they treated me like a human being, and they provided a caring, safe, accepting environment for me. And these are things that all Indigenous students need, all students in general. But right now I'm addressing how we can better support Indigenous students in school education systems off reserve. So just thinking about that and my own experience, and then I go to the experience of being a teacher, I've had many students who, again, could otherwise be perceived as not being engaged when really they have other things going on in their life. They have other responsibilities. Some of them are helping, they're in a caregiving role and they're assisting with helping their younger siblings. Some of them have lost some loved ones in their families, not just one. I remember there was a time where I had several students who were losing family member after family member, all within like a few months, even a few weeks' time. And you can only imagine how that would make somebody feel. One loss alone is a lot. And if you add in consecutively losing people in your life, how do you even stop to be able to grieve? How do you even begin to address one loss when another loss happens? And this is a reality. This is our reality. And that's another story for another time that I will love to share about what's happening in our Indigenous communities and our mortality rates. It's alarming. But going back into, if we can look at our students from a 360 and realize they have other things going on in their lives, and also we just may not be doing our very best as a teacher in that moment or in that subject that we're teaching to engage students. Again, we need to step back and look inward and reflect inward and say, okay, what is it I need to be doing? What is it I can be doing? And what is it I should be doing that can make me a better teacher, can make me teach this subject with more enthusiasm or come in with a fresh start? And, I will say this, teaching is not easy. Any teacher will tell you that. Teaching is a joy, and teaching is filled with many different types of challenges, and not just anybody can be a teacher. But for those of us who are lucky enough and brave enough and confident enough and open enough to learning to be a teacher, well, we have some special gifts that are placed in our hands, and those are students. They are gifts to us. And the profession of teaching is a gift in itself, because you will gain experiences in your life that someone else who's never been a teacher will never know. Just back to addressing this lack of engagement. Well, really, what is it? Is it, when you think about the school systems, education systems, really, I think if we turn the question around to, or how should education systems engage with students, Indigenous students? We can look at it from that viewpoint, then we're not placing it on the student. And we are taking responsibility as education systems to do better, because we can do better and we need to do better. Furthermore, we must always ensure as educators that we do not marginalize any child, any student, and in this case, Indigenous students, because Indigenous peoples are marginalized enough as it is in so many ways out there in the world, in society, in all these other areas where we are challenged constantly. So education should really be a place where that never happens to any Indigenous student. So going forward here, continuing on, there are many variables that support or challenge any student's level engagement in school. And I want to turn that question around too, from being, instead of asking, how can we learn about the lack of engagement of Indigenous students, to instead, what are the levels of engagement that we can support Indigenous students in? Because there are many different levels of engagement. If we think of ourselves as adults, we don't always necessarily feel engaged about things all the time. So you can imagine being a child or a youth, and you've got so much going on in your mind. And in this day and age, children and youth really have different sets of challenges that any one of us who are adults in 2020 as teachers will have ever had when we were their age. Life is very different now, and you add in technology, you add in the different scopes of how young people communicate with each other. There's lots of challenges in that in itself. So we can remember that, and we can keep at the forefront in our mind the different types of challenges that children and youth are encountering. That will help us understand them even more so as best we can. And we must always keep this in mind for all students. There are different levels of engagement in school, and including for Indigenous students. So I would like to furthermore add that Indigenous students need to see Indigenous educators in education systems off reserve. My experience and understanding about the levels of engagement of Indigenous students in schools off reserve is connected to many of the long-standing issues that are problematic and stagnant in education systems right now. One being the lack of visibility of Nitsitabi of Indigenous educators working in education systems off reserve, that is in the cities and towns. In my 20 plus years career of teaching and working in education, And through my experience teaching many children and youth in many communities, both on reserve and off reserve, I can attest that any child or youth who is experiencing a form of adversity in their young life can and will have success in school despite if they feel a sense of belonging, if they know their teachers and the staff in the school care for them, and that they are provided with a safe space to grow and learn as not only a student, but first and foremost as a human being. This becomes increasingly evident when Indigenous students see people from their communities working in the schools in various capacities: teachers, librarians, support staff, principals, counselors, superintendents, and so on. There is great power when Niitsitapi children and youth can identify with and connect with the staff and the teachers who share their cultural values, backgrounds, ways of knowing, and when they share community connections and when they share and or understand their historical and cultural backgrounds. Our Indigenous children and youth recognize this, and they feel a sense of pride, of belonging, and connection when they meet other Indigenous people working in their schools. They also do notice it when this is missing. They ask, where are the teachers who come from my community? Where are the teachers who know my culture, who are part of my culture, and who know my history, who understand me? Who can I trust to look out for me in school? Why don't I see Indigenous educators working in my schools? These are very important questions because I have worked with many Indigenous youth, and I'm noticing them ask these questions. They're wondering too, where are the Indigenous educators working in education systems off reserve? And we're not just talking about one support staff hired here and there. We're talking about Indigenous teachers, Indigenous principals, Indigenous counselors, Indigenous superintendents, and so on. Secondly, speaking from my experience, levels of engagement for Indigenous students is connected to their families. Firstly, the levels of engagement with their families, parents, caregivers, what does that look like? Have the teachers, principals, school staff made consistent and appropriate efforts and actions to make Indigenous families feel connected and welcomed into the schools, the classrooms, the learning environments? Are the parents only contacted when there is an issue of concern or an incident that took place at school regarding their child? Is there access to transportation to attend school events and activities, such as parent-teacher conferences, games, practices, and so on? Was there a previous negative encounter that the child's parents or family members have had with the school? It could even be just one incident, one negative encounter for an Indigenous parent or family member to not feel welcomed by that school, or to feel discouraged or not want to engage with the school. Schools need to consistently do better at how they appropriately engage with Indigenous families and students. This is an especially important part of engaging Indigenous students. This is not only inclusive of visuals around the schools, such as posters or images that showcase Indigenous cultures or communities. That's important, don't get me wrong, but we need to go beyond that. We need to go beyond having the one cultural event of the year, such as a year-end powwow, and feel like we have done our job as education systems that make Indigenous students feel welcomed. No, we need to go beyond that. It is also part of the school culture. In fact, it is a big component of the school culture. What does the current school culture look like? What does your school culture look like? If you were to step back and just take in some observation right now in your mind's eye and ask yourself, well, what do I think if I were to walk in the school as somebody from the outside looking in, what would I see that is either supporting, not supporting, or just neutral, if you will, when it comes to welcoming Indigenous students and families? Taking that look at things is very important. Take a look inside your classroom. Take a look at yourself. We need to always be self-reflective and self-aware as educators, how we are projecting outward to students, all students, of course, but again, focusing on Indigenous student learning and success here. What is it we're saying? What are the words we are speaking that are coming out of our mouth? How are they going to be interpreted by our students? What are we projecting through our body language? What are we projecting through the way we express things and talk about things? How are we being sensitive? How are we being aware? What are we doing to constantly learn so we can continue to do better as teachers and educators? And with the school culture, this is not a one person, such as the principal, for example. This is not one person work. This includes all staff in the school culture of how to appropriately engage with Indigenous families and students to create a welcoming environment. It is not a one-day workshop attended by all. It is not a one keynote speaker speaks for everybody all. It is not a once-a-year cultural activity. It is not hiring one Indigenous support staff. It is not thinking you know all that you need to know to engage appropriately. It is not thinking you know everything about the history of what has happened. It is constant learning. It is constant self-awareness for your own attitudes. It is questioning your assumptions and value systems you were raised with. It is holding yourself and your colleagues and your school, culture, environment accountable. It is being genuine, not doing it because you must so that this child or that child will attend school regularly. It is doing it because you know in your heart it is the right thing to do. It is looking inward and reflecting outward. It is not coming from a savior complex where you're going to save this child. It is being uncomfortable. It is realizing why you became a teacher. It is understanding how residential schools have impacted the many generations of Indigenous children and youth, even if they have not attended residential school. It is putting action to your words. It is ensuring every Indigenous child who comes through your classroom and school doors always feels welcomed. Teachers are in a tremendously unique role to be able to do better than what has happened to Indigenous people in school systems. We teachers have the ability to shape society because we have an impact on every child that we teach. Every child who comes through our classroom doors, who enters the school, we have the ability to impact their life in a positive way, in a negative way, or in a neutral way, and just simply let them not have any sort of unique or incredible experience for them, while they're in our care. Teachers can teach the truth of what has happened, and teachers need to teach the truth of what has happened in Canada to Indigenous peoples in residential schools. Teachers teach the truth of what has happened so they can continue to teach students that this is not an overnight Band-Aid situation, but that as members of society, they can and should have a role in helping to make Indigenous students, communities, and families feel and know that they belong and that they are the first peoples of this land. Teachers, we have a platform to be able to teach students the true history of what has happened. So I ask you, those of you who are listening and who may be teaching currently or who have taught or may be getting ready to teach, join the teaching profession, what is it that you want to do to be able to support Indigenous student learners? And what does that look like? How are you going to do that? What do you need to do within yourself? And what resources do you need to access to continue to do better as a teacher for all students and for Indigenous students? I want to finish off today and just let you know how special it is for all teachers to have this role, this unique role to be in a child's life. And so that will take me to my concluding thoughts on this. There's lots to unpack. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not a one size, one answer for all. And there are many different approaches and ways to support Indigenous student success and learning and to understand what does that really look like. And it is my hope that you take away from my thoughts today. Self-awareness. What does that look like for you? We are all on a journey, and as teachers, we all have our own unique abilities and gifts and ways of being. And so how can we enhance who we are as people and as people who love to teach and learn? And how can we connect that with supporting Indigenous students so that they can thrive and continue on to do what they are meant to do? Big things, many things in this world. And we get to be part of that simply by spending time with them in our classrooms and teaching them and learning from them. So here are my final 4 teachings for you today. Number 1, be the people you needed and had in your life as a child. So be the people that you wish you had as that child in school, or the people that were there for you. Be that person for your students. Number 2, you do have a role in raising children and youth. As a teacher, you get to be a part of many children's lives. That is one of the most important roles you will ever have in your life. Number 3, your role is so deeply valued and special. And while we may not get many pats on the back, or sometimes we get exhausted by what we do, because being a teacher is incredibly important and exhaustive work at the same time, but also it's important to know how special and valued we are. And lastly, number 4, be okay with being uncomfortable. By being uncomfortable, that means we are open to learning. And when we can model that and embed that into who we are and embrace that, our students are going to see that. And that's going to help them open themselves up to the learning journey that they are on. And be okay with being uncomfortable when you are learning about the histories of what has happened to Indigenous people. And when you are that person at the table that may be hearing other people make inappropriate statements or comments or misinformed comments or statements, and you can be that person to correct them so they can learn and do better. So I hope you enjoyed this and that you can take some of these teachings and share them with others, share them with your students, and most importantly, so that you can continue to be the best teacher you can be for all Indigenous students that you encounter, for that is truly a gift. Ka dakiramatsin.